They were floating on circular platforms. The phenomenon always happened at night, and the first thing that the villagers would see were saucers, little saucers flying around. And the saucers had a series of lights on them, and they had some kind of a floodlight attached to the front that could be turned on and off. There was a group of villagers who pursued the assailants, and they told me these guys did not move like human beings. They were inhumanly agile. One guy told me he blasted one of these assailants with a shotgun. He says that this particular individual was dressed in silver body armor. Critical testimony that we heard came from the 15-year-old girl who was nearly abducted. He floated up next to her, and then he landed next to her, and he grabbed her from behind. He put his hand over her mouth, and they began to make an incision under her jawline, and she starts to struggle. We were the only ones who had come to investigate the phenomenon.
No kidding.
Nobody else had gone. Now, 2 police officers, Peruvian police officers, were dispatched from Iquitos, from the city of Iquitos, to investigate a particular incident, which was the attempted abduction of a 15-year-old girl, which is part of this narrative. I failed to mention that when we were talking about the publication of those videos that went viral on social media. Part of those videos featured footage and testimony of the attempted abduction of a 15-year-old girl. And I told you that they were claiming that, or they were saying that this was an attack by face peelers, pelacaras, and somebody had cut her neck under her jawline, and she was found unconscious, and that was part of the story. And so because there was an attempted abduction...
How did they fend off the abduction?
She screamed, and the villagers were already in a state of of vigilance. And when she screamed, they came running with their shotguns, and they saw the assailants. And the assailants were dressed in black armored body suits, head to foot. They had helmets on. They had almond-shaped tinted eye lenses that were described to me variously as green and yellow. And most remarkably, they were floating on circular platforms. Like, the best way I can describe it is like, do you remember those circular sleds? They look like garbage can lids.
A snow sled.
Yeah, like a circular snow sled.
A saucer.
A saucer, yeah. That's what these guys were flying around on, like circular platforms. And this is what the villagers were encountering. But when I went into the village, they received us in this very formal, cordial manner. And then we began the investigation in earnest. And we walked around the village, accompanied by the Apu, and we interviewed dozens of villagers, men, women, children. And what we heard was extraordinary. And at first, when we began to hear these testimonies, we were nervous, because at first I was thinking cartel. I was thinking this could be cartel. This could be a serious, well-funded operation, cartel operation, and that made us nervous. And in fact, I remember after conducting some of the initial interviews, we went back to the boat. We were staying on the riverboat. The riverboat was docked on the bank of the village, on the bank of the river up against the village. And we went back to the riverboat after about 2 hours of interviewing people, and we had a meeting with the Navy commandos. By the way, they're jungle commandos. They're trained in jungle survival, and really great guys. And so we had a little security meeting. And we were talking about the possibility that this is cartel, and that if it's cartel, they probably are still in the area and they might be surveilling us. And what do? We need to make sure that we're prepared, especially at night. So that was our initial thought. Mm-hmm. Then I went back into the village and we continued to conduct the investigations. The Apu took me to where the videos were captured, and they explained to me what happened. And I'm going to try and summarize to you what was happening. And remember, this was happening for a few weeks consecutively. Not every single day, but, within those few weeks, it was happening frequently. The phenomenon always happened at night. And the first thing that the villagers would see were saucers, little saucers flying around. And the saucers had a series of lights on them. And they had some kind of a floodlight attached to the front that could be turned on and off. So the first thing that they would begin to see are these saucers, these little saucers flying around above the village.
How many?
2, usually 2. The assailants came 2 by 2. And then they would see the saucers go into the jungle and land. And shortly thereafter, 2 individuals would make an incursion into the village. And these individuals were wearing, as I said earlier, black armored bodysuits, head to foot, again, with helmets, almond-shaped eye lenses. The assailants were described as being very tall, taller than me. I'm 6'1", and all of the villagers said they were taller than me. And I would say, how tall? A foot taller, 2 feet taller? Is usually around 7 feet tall is what they would indicate. About a foot taller than me. They described them as being inhumanly agile. So some of the guys actually pursued. There was a group of villagers who pursued the assailants. And they told me these guys did not move like human beings. They were inhumanly agile. And they pursued one of these assailants through the jungle, and he dove into the river, quickly swam across the river, hopped onto the bank, and flew off into the sky.
Without the saucer.
I think the saucer was docked over there. And in fact, in that case, I can't recall if in that particular case, if he hopped on the saucer or if he just disappeared into the jungle. I'm pretty sure he hopped on the saucer, because that's what would happen. They would pursue them, and these guys would go back to where they landed, get back on their saucers, and take off at a high rate of speed. The saucers were silent, except for when they initially took off. There was sort of like a sound like compressed air. That's what the villagers expressed to me, like a sound of compressed air being released. But for the most part, they were silent. Whatever this body armor was that these assailants were wearing is bulletproof, at least against shotgun shells. I mean, these guys use birdshot in the jungle. But what they were doing, because they would shoot the assailants, some of them at point blank range. They would discharge their shotgun at point blank range at some of these assailants, and they told me they could hear the BBs dinking off of the body armor. The assailants never spoke, except for on one occasion, which we'll talk about. And one guy told me he blasted one of these assailants with a shotgun. I think it was only about 15 feet away, maybe even closer, maybe 10 feet away. He blasted him with the shotgun. He says that this particular individual was dressed in silver body armor, unlike the rest. And he swears to me, this one was silver. Everyone else said black. But for whatever reason, this one was dressed in silver body armor. He blasts him with the shotgun, and the impact knocks the guy on his butt, the assailant. And then he just jumps up and flies back up to a vertical position and floated away. Floated. And he's not on the saucer. So 2 things became apparent. Number 1, they're making incursions into the village initially on their saucers. They're flying, and they're surfing. The villagers said they would see them. They put the flashlight up on the saucer, and they would see these guys like surfing on these things. And then when they came into the village, they disembarked from the saucers, and then they came into the village, they were still able to float based on some kind of mechanism that was incorporated into their footwear, into their boots. And they told me that the boots had 2 discs on the bottom, like one on the heel, one near the toe. They had 2 discs, and that the discs they emitted some kind of a light, and this enabled the assailants to float. And when this guy shot this one that was dressed in the silver body armor, that's how he popped back up. He was floating. And this isn't just 1 or 2 testimonies. This is dozens and dozens of testimonies from different people in the village. They all say they all saw the same thing, all of them. Not every person in the village encountered the phenomenon, but the ones that did all described the same thing in the same detail. The assailants were described as being able to bound over the huts, bound over the houses, so they could jump over the houses. As I said, they were impervious to the shotguns. And what I was about to say about that was that the villagers, realizing that their bird shot wasn't having much of an effect, what they did was they showed me how they were doing this. They would open up the cartridge, empty out the BBs, and weld some of the BBs together to make slugs. Mm-hmm. And then they would put them back in there, and they were firing, these makeshift slugs to no effect. They also set up traps around the village to try and catch one of these assailants. And the traps consist of the typical kind of traps that they use out there in the jungle. They're just a tube with a bullet inside, and there's like a hammer mechanism, and then there's a tripwire. And they usually use these to hunt small game. They put them in the game trails, and they catch. This is a part of their. This is what hunters commonly do. But this time they retrofitted these traps to shoot these assailants. So they put these welded bird shot in the cartridge, and then they lifted the tube higher. And what they were trying to calculate was the knees. They wanted to shoot the assailants at the knees. So usually they're about a foot off the ground. They lifted them 2 or 3 feet off the ground, and they set up 9 of them around the village. And at night, they would hear the traps going off. They'd hear the shotgun blasts. And then when they would run out there to see what happened, obviously they're expecting to see one of these assailants laying on the ground with a hole in his knee. There was nothing. No residue, no blood, nothing.
No footprints.
The footprints were there. And the footprints were 2 discs. Remember I said they have disc on the heel and on the toe. They were the imprints of discs. But you could also see like the outline of a shoe. But they were ineffective at actually killing or injuring any of the assailants. And these are very dangerous traps. And in fact, one of the ladies from the village accidentally tripped one, and she got shot in the thigh about a month before we arrived. And so they quit doing the traps because they're very dangerous. So they had... They decided to start patrolling the village sometime in July because they were freaked out. Everybody was completely freaked out. And they had been running their patrols every night for a few months, and were still patrolling when we got there. In addition to the discs that they were flying around on, there were also advanced aerospace vehicles involved in the phenomenon. What do I mean by that?
You know what everybody dreads? The inbox. I've gone through thousands and thousands of emails, and I hear you loud and clear. So we're making it official. The Vigilance Elite store is fully stocked. We're dropping new gear more often. Some limited edition, some permanent staples. We've got hats, tees, and even Vigilance Elite tumblers. And yes, before you ask, I'm still booze-free. It's been 3.5 years. Relax. It's just water. If you were one of those emails, consider this your green light. Head over to ShawnRyanShow.com and stock up.
The villagers were describing 2 things for me. They were describing the discs that the guys were flying on, circular discs, and then some of them were drawing in the dirt for me these other craft. And these other craft were they were sort of delta shaped, but they were shaped like an acorn on its side. So they had rounded edges, but they were sort of delta shaped, so something like that. Mm. And they were large. They were the size of like a large helicopter. And multiple villagers drew these for me in the dirt. And one particular gentleman drew for me on an acrylic board. And he described it in great detail. And these craft would hover silently over the village, and they would be stationary, and then sometimes they would move away at different rates of speed. But there were multiple witnesses to these craft. In fact, the gentleman who drew the craft for me on the acrylic chalkboard, he said that one night he was right in front of the village in the river on his canoe around 3 o'clock in the morning, pulling up his nets. And as he's pulling up his nets, he said it was like somebody turned the lights on. He said it was like the sun came up suddenly, and everything is illuminated around him. And he realized that there was something above him, so he looks up and he sees this bright light shining down on him, and he sees this craft hovering in the air about 40, 50 feet above him. And he's sitting there in the canoe, right on the river. This craft is silently hovering above him, and it's semi-transparent. He said it had like a transparent mesh around it. You could see the fuselage, you could see the body of the craft, but it was also somewhat transparent, and you could see two individuals sitting inside. You had one up in the front and one in the rear of this craft, and it was shaped precisely like what everyone else described. It was that acorn shape. Again, acorn on its side, not upright. And he was just in shock, and he said as he was looking at this craft, it had little stubby protrusions, rounded protrusions in the place of wings, so it didn't have wings. And these protrusions opened up, and there was a series of lights, like rapidly blinking lights. And he said it was like it was scanning, and then they folded back in, and the craft began to move away. And as it moved away, there was a low frequency hum. So, as I said, we've got advanced aerospace vehicles in play here, not just, so the narrative of jetpack miners was obviously becoming less and less, was becoming more and more absurd, let's put it that way. And the cartel explanation was becoming less and less likely as we were conducting this investigation, because I don't believe that cartels have this kind of technology. The assailants did have backpacks. Everybody did describe, but it was like a small hard shell pack that was attached to the body armor. And they clearly were floating with whatever mechanism was attached to the bottom of their boots, and they were flying on the discs. They were not jetpacks. So we surmise that maybe we're looking at some kind of a battery, maybe a mini reactor. I don't know. That maybe that's the energy source is the backpack. The most critical testimony that we heard came from the 15-year-old girl who was nearly abducted. Her name is Talia. And we went into the village one evening specifically with the intention to interview her, because she had had a close encounter with the assailants. When we went into the village, it's the evening, and in the Amazon, in the evening in the plaza, all the men are playing soccer, all the women are playing volleyball. And so we're walking around, everyone's kind of just having fun playing soccer or volleyball. And we look over and we see this girl sitting all by herself, 15-year-old girl, sitting up against a hut. And she's just all by herself, just sitting there. And the Apu informed us that was Talia. And I said, well, can we talk to her? He said, well, I'll talk to her dad and see if her dad can approach her, because she's very traumatized. And so we're standing there, and Apu goes to find the father, and she looks over at us, me and Doug. And we're pretty imposing characters. I mean, Doug's a big guy, and I'm tall, and we're imposing looking gringos. We got a machete and so forth. She looks over at us. She casually glances at us, and as soon as she sees us, she starts to tremble. And she's maybe 20, 30 yards away. She sees us, she instantly starts to tremble. And she takes her hair and she moves it to the side of her face to block us from seeing her face. You understand what I'm saying? She takes her hair and moves. And she's sitting there trembling. And she starts to block her face like this. And instantly I recognize, wow, this is serious trauma. And our heart broke for this girl. And the father went over to her and talked to her and tried to convince her to come over and talk to us. And she wouldn't come. She got up and ran away. And the father, he came over and said, she's just really, really traumatized. And he said, but here's what I want you to do. Come by tomorrow morning to my house, and I will bring her. And you guys will be able to talk to her. So that's what we did. The following morning, we visited their home, and we waited in the backyard, and the father eventually was able to convince Talia to come and talk to us. And when I encountered Talia, when she saw me, she started to cry, and she was trembling uncontrollably. And she started to cry, and again, our hearts broke for this girl. Obviously severe PTSD, and we were triggering it. So she related her story. I was eventually able. It took a while, for her to warm up to us. She was associating me and Doug with her assailants. So, and you'll understand why in a minute. So she had this PTSD, and she was associating us with the assailants. So I interviewed her, and she told me that one evening back in July, she was in her backyard, and she had this long stick, and she was trying to knock down some fruit from the tree to make a drink out of it for dinner. And the sun is just starting to go down. And again, the incursions only happened after dark, or as it was getting dark. And she knocked down the fruit from the tree, and she bent over to pick up the fruit. And when she bent over, she felt a wind at her back, and the dry leaves began to rustle at her feet. And she looked up to see what was generating this wind, and she saw this person dressed head to foot in black body armor, flying on a disc, and she went like this. He was flying on a disc, and behind her house, there's like a little gully, and it's a forested gully, so it's jungle back there. And then around this little forested gully, there's other houses. And there's a little hill that comes up to her house. And this assailant, who they all were calling again Pelacada, the face peeler, he floated up next to her, and then he landed next to her. And he grabbed her from behind, he put his hand over her mouth. And then she saw another one coming behind him in the same manner, floating, like surfing up on this hoverboard, this circular platform. He floats up the hill, lands in front of her, and he grabs her legs. So now she's being held from behind by one assailant, and then her legs, the other guy has her legs. And they lift her up together on their hoverboards, on their circular discs. They lift her up, and they fly her behind like this thatch roof chicken coop. And then they land. And her mouth is covered. And then they proceed, the one who was holding her feet, he took out a powder, and then he took some sort of a solution, and he mixed it in the powder. And then he took a nasal syringe, and he sucked it up and shot it up her nose. And this made her feel sedated. And then they took out a long tube, looked like a toothpaste tube or something, and this had a cream in it, and the guy that was holding her mouth from behind, he started to smear this cream all over her face. And as he was doing it, the guy in front said, be careful, don't put too much on, don't apply too much, because you're going to ruin the flesh. That's what she said.
In English?
So this is the first time that now we're hearing testimony that these assailants, of these assailants speaking. They spoke in Spanish.
In Spanish.
Yeah, so she referred to the larger, one was taller than the other. The larger one was taller than me. The other one was at least as tall as me, if not taller. She referred to the larger one as the gringo. And the shorter one, who was still taller than me, as the Peruvian. Because when they spoke, the larger one had a gringo accent, Spanish accent, and the other one sounded just like them. He sounded Peruvian, so he didn't have an accent. And so after they apply this stuff to her face, they take out what Doug and I think is a laser scalpel. They take out this little device that has like a laser light on it, and they begin to make an incision under her jawline. And she starts to struggle. And so they actually restarted the incision. So you can see in photos of her and in the videos that I published on YouTube, you can see the 2 incision lines. One was here and then the other one right under it. And as they're beginning to cut under her jawline, she's struggling. This is the last energy she has. She starts to freak out, and she gets her hand underneath the helmet of the guy behind her that still has his hand over her mouth, right? And she starts to lift up on the helmet. And he gets agitated and he freaks out a little bit because he doesn't want his face to be seen, apparently. That's what she told me. He freaks out for a second and they drop her. And when they drop her, she lets out a blood-curdling scream. And remember, the villages are in a state of high vigilance. So the men are all sitting in front of their houses with shotguns and flashlights. This is not the first incursion. They know something's going on. They are aware of these assailants, so they're ready. So when she screams, her brother and a group of other villagers who live in proximity to her house come running instantly. Like they're on the scene in 20 seconds. And I talked to them. They showed up with their flashlights and their shotguns. And what they saw was Talia laying on the ground, bloodied up, blood all over her face and neck. She's passed out at this point, and the assailants are hovering like this on their circular platforms. And Talia, before she passed out, after she screamed, she said that the assailants said, let's go, we got to get out of here. And then one of them said, no, we can't just leave her here. And so they tried to drag her up the hill as they're floating on their platforms. They tried to drag her up the hill, but they dropped her because the other villagers were on the scene. And so the villagers are there with their flashlights trained on these guys, 2 of them, and they maneuver to where there's an opening in the canopy, and they shoot up through the canopy.
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.